My son looked me in the eyes on my birthday and said, "You were never really my dad," then laughed as he pushed a DNA test kit across the table as if it were some kind of party joke. I remember the room going strangely quiet the way a house feels right before a storm hits. He smirked, waiting for me to break, waiting for me to defend myself, waiting for me to shrink the way he and his wife had slowly trained me to over the years. Instead, I simply stared at the box, wondering when exactly my own child had turned into a stranger. He laughed again, louder this time. "Maybe this will finally prove who you really are." In that moment, something inside me shifted. Not anger, not shock. Something deeper. Something steady. They thought they knew everything about me, what I had, what I didn't have, what I was willing to tolerate. They thought humiliating me on my birthday would be the final blow, that I would quietly fade into the background, just like always. They had no idea that a single cruel gift would trigger a chain of events already years in the making, involving documents, lawyers, and truths they were never meant to discover. And when the estate lawyer called them months later, asking for an urgent meeting about me, they walked into that office confident, ready to gloat, certain I had finally been exposed. They had no idea they were stepping straight into their own undoing, and by the time they realized what was waiting for them on the other side of that conference table, it was already far too late. My name is Adrian Mercer. I'm 68 years old, a retired structural engineer who spent 4 decades designing bridges and buildings that would outlast the people who walked through them. I built my life the same way I built those structures, carefully, patiently, with foundations meant to endure. But on the night of my birthday, I learned that even the strongest foundations can crack when the people you love decide to break them. I had spent the afternoon preparing dinner in the house that still carried Evelyn's presence in every corner. 2 years since she passed, and I still caught myself listening for her footsteps in the hallway, still expected to see her standing at the kitchen window with her morning coffee. The table was set for 3 that evening. The good china she had always saved for special occasions, candles lit the way she liked them. I told myself this dinner would be different. Julian had been distant since his mother's death, pulled away by work by his wife, by something I could not name. Tonight I thought we would reconnect. Tonight my son would come home to me. They arrived at 7, punctual as always. Lydia entered first, her heels clicking against the hardwood floor Evelyn and I had installed ourselves 30 years ago. She wore a dress that probably cost more than my first car, her smile bright and practiced. Julian followed behind her like a shadow. His shoulders hunched in a way I did not remember from his childhood. He used to stand tall, my boy. He used to look me in the eye. "Happy birthday, Dad," he said. But the words sounded rehearsed, empty of the warmth they once carried. Dinner began well enough, or so I wanted to believe. I had made pot roast Julian's favorite from when he was young. But Lydia controlled the conversation from the first bite, steering every topic toward subjects that made me feel like a guest in my own home. She talked about property values in the neighborhood, about how older homeowners often struggled to maintain large houses alone. She mentioned her father's expertise in asset management and how important it was for families to plan ahead for transitions. "Transitions?" I asked, setting down my fork. "You know," she said, her voice sweet as antifreeze, "making sure everything is in order for the future. My father always said that families who plan together stay together." I looked at Julian, waiting for him to say something to redirect the conversation the way Evelyn would have done, with a gentle laugh and a change of subject. But he just stared at his plate, pushing food around like a child avoiding his vegetables. The tension built through the meal like pressure in a pipe. I could feel something coming, something wrong, but I kept telling myself I was imagining it. This was my son. This was my family. Whatever distance had grown between us, surely it could be bridged with time and patience. After dessert, Julian reached into his jacket and pulled out an envelope. His hands trembled slightly as he placed it on the table between us. "Dad," he said, his voice hollow, "there's something you need to see." Inside was a single sheet of paper, a DNA test result, clinical and cold, with percentages and markers that meant nothing to me at first glance. Then I saw the conclusion printed at the bottom, and the words blurred as my vision narrowed. "You were never really my dad," Julian said. I looked up at him, searching for some sign that this was a joke, a misunderstanding, anything but what it appeared to be. But Julian would not meet my eyes. His gaze darted to the left, to the window, to anywhere but my face. And beside him, Lydia watched with a thin smile that she did not bother to hide. The room felt suddenly airless, the walls pressing inward. 40 years of memories crashed through my mind, teaching Julian to ride a bicycle, sitting beside him in the hospital when he broke his arm at 12, walking him down the aisle at his wedding. All of it, every moment now, called into question by a piece of paper. And then cutting through the chaos, I heard Evelyn's voice. Not a memory, but something sharper, more urgent, words she had spoken months before she died, words I had nearly forgotten until this moment. "If they ever tell you that," she had whispered, her hand gripping mine with surprising strength, "never believe them." I didn't sleep that night. Evelyn's words echoed through the darkness of our bedroom, mixing with Julian's hollow voice and the image of Lydia's satisfied smile. I sat in the chair by the window until dawn crept over the trees, turning the sky from black to gray to pale gold. The DNA test lay on my nightstand where I had placed it, that single sheet of paper, carrying enough poison to destroy 40 years of fatherhood. But Evelyn had warned me. Somehow she had known this moment would come, and she had armed me with doubt. The question was doubt about what the doorbell rang at 9 the next morning. I had barely finished my coffee, my mind still foggy from sleeplessness, when I opened the door to find Lydia standing on my porch. She was alone, dressed casually in clothes that still managed to look expensive, her face arranged in an expression of concern that did not reach her eyes. "Adrian," she said, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. "I wanted to check on you. Last night was difficult for everyone." I watched her move through my living room, her gaze traveling across the furniture, the paintings on the walls, the antique clock Evelyn had inherited from her grandmother. She was not looking at memories. She was taking inventory. "I'm fine," I said carefully. "Are you—" She settled onto the sofa, crossing her legs, making herself comfortable in a space that was not hers. "I've been thinking about your situation, Adrian, living alone in such a big house at your age. Have you considered your options? Long-term care facilities have come such a long way. Some of them are really quite nice now." The question landed like a stone in still water. Long-term care, nursing homes, places where inconvenient old people could be stored away, their houses emptied, their assets liquidated. "I'm 68, I said, keeping my voice level. "Not 98. I'm perfectly capable of living in my own home." "Of course you are," she replied, her smile never wavering. "I'm just saying it's important to plan ahead. My father always believed in being prepared for transitions. He had such expertise in managing these things for families, making sure assets were protected, properly allocated." She paused, tilting her head slightly. "Have you updated your will recently? Made sure everything is in order?" I studied her face, searching for any crack in the mask. There was none. She had rehearsed this performance until it was seamless, every word calculated to sound like concern while pushing towards something else entirely, something darker. "My affairs are in order," I said. She nodded slowly, her eyes still moving around the room. "Good. That's good." She left 20 minutes later, claiming she had errands to run. But instead of driving away, she walked around to the side garden, phone pressed to her ear. I watched from the kitchen window, my heart pounding as I slowly opened the window just enough to hear. "He's shaken," she said, her voice completely different now, all warmth stripped away. The DNA test hit hard. He didn't sleep. I could see it in his face. A pause. "No, we need to be patient. He'll break soon. Then everything is ours. Just keep Julian focused. Don't let him go soft." The words hit me like ice water poured directly into my veins. This was not family tension. This was not a misunderstanding or grief manifesting in ugly ways. This was a coordinated attack planned and executed with precision. My son was not drifting away from me. He was being steered. I stepped back from the window, my hands trembling. For a moment I could not breathe. Then slowly the shock transformed into something else. Something colder and more useful. I'd spent my career identifying structural weaknesses, calculating stress points, predicting where failures would occur. Now I understood I was not dealing with family. I was dealing with a threat. That afternoon, my neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, stopped by with a casserole dish the way she always did when she sensed trouble. We had known each other for 30 years, since before Julian was born. She was 74 now, widowed like me, with sharp eyes that missed nothing. "I saw Lydia leaving this morning," she said, settling into the kitchen chair Evelyn used to favor. She stopped by my house last week, asked all sorts of questions about property values in the neighborhood, wanted to know about ownership transfers, how long you'd lived here, whether the house was paid off. I felt my jaw tighten. Did she? Mrs. Patterson hesitated, stirring her tea slowly. I don't mean to gossip, Adrian. You know that's not my way. But I've heard things about her family, about her father. What things? She looked up at me, something troubled in her expression. He ran some kind of financial consulting business years ago, retired now, supposedly. But there were stories. People said he took advantage of folks, convinced them to sign things they didn't understand. What kind of people? Mrs. Patterson lowered her voice as if the walls themselves might be listening. There were people he hurt, Adrian, elderly people, people like us. Mrs. Patterson's words followed me through the rest of the day, settling into my chest like stones. Elderly people, people like us. I thanked her for the casserole, walked her to the door, and spent the next several hours staring at the walls of a house that suddenly felt less like a home and more like a target. By evening, the sky had turned the color of bruises and rain began to fall in heavy sheets that blurred the windows into gray. I could not stay inside. The walls were pressing in every room, filled with memories that now felt contaminated by doubt and suspicion. I grabbed my keys, pulled on my jacket, and drove into the storm without any destination in mind. The windshield wipers beat a frantic rhythm as I navigated roads I had driven 1,000 times, past landmarks that had marked the chapters of my life. The elementary school where Julian learned to read, the park where we flew kites on Sunday afternoons, the church where Evelyn and I renewed our vows on our 25th anniversary. I pulled over on a dark stretch of road outside town, the rain hammering against the roof like fists demanding entry. For a long moment, I just sat there, hands gripping the steering wheel, staring at nothing. 68 years of building a life, 40 years of raising a son, nearly half a century of loving a woman who is now beyond my reach. And what did I have to show for it? A DNA test that called me a fraud. A daughter-in-law who saw me as an obstacle. A son who could not meet my eyes. The tears came without warning, welling up from somewhere deep and primal. I had not wept like this since Evelyn's funeral, had not allowed myself the luxury of breaking down. Engineers do not break down. We assess damage, we calculate repairs, we rebuild. But there in the darkness, with rain streaming down the windows like the world itself was crying, I let myself shatter. I wept for Evelyn, for the guidance I desperately needed. I wept for Julian, for the boy he had been and the stranger he had become. And I wept for myself, for the fool who had believed that love was enough to hold a family together. When the storm inside me finally subsided, I drove home through streets that had turned to rivers. The house was dark and cold when I entered, but I didn't bother with lights. I walked through rooms by memory, my fingers trailing along furniture and walls, until I found myself in the study where Evelyn and I had spent countless evenings reading side by side. Her chair still sat where she had left it, a small blanket folded over the arm. On the bookshelf behind her chair, I spotted the old photo albums we had assembled over the years. I pulled one down at random, settling into Evelyn's chair to flip through its pages. The photographs were a timeline of our family wedding pictures with embarrassing hairstyles, snapshots of our first tiny apartment, and then Julian. Julian as a newborn, wrinkled and red and perfect. Julian taking his first steps. Julian at 5, at 10, at 15. I stopped at a photograph of Julian at age 8, taken on a fishing trip to Lake Champlain. He was holding up a small trout, grinning with pride, his face tilted toward the camera. And there it was, unmistakable. The jawline that mirrored my own. The shape of the eyes that Evelyn always said were pure Mercer, the slight asymmetry of his smile that I saw every morning in my own reflection. How could a DNA test say otherwise? How could science deny what was written so clearly in flesh and bone? A memory surfaced unbidden. 5 years ago, in the middle of the night, my phone had rung with Julian's number. His voice had been tight with panic words tumbling out in fragments. He needed money, a lot of money, $200,000. He could not explain why, could not give details, just begged me to trust him. Evelyn and I had wired the funds the next morning without question, because that is what parents do. We never learned what it was for. Julian said the crisis had passed and we let the matter drop. But now in the darkness of my study, I wondered, what had my son been hiding? What had demanded such a sum with such urgency? My phone buzzed in my pocket, startling me from my thoughts. The caller ID showed a name I had not seen in months. Clara Whitmore. Clara and I had been friends since college, decades of shared history before life had scattered us to different cities. She and Evelyn had grown close in later years, exchanging letters and calls that I was only partially aware of. "Adrian," she said when I answered, her voice warm, but carrying an undertone of concern. "I've been thinking about you. How are you holding up?" The question felt weighted too specific to be casual, as if she already knew something was wrong, as if she'd been waiting for this call. "I'm managing," I said carefully. "Why do you ask?" There was a pause, a hesitation that lasted just a beat too long. "Just a feeling," she said. "Call it intuition, but Adrian, if you ever need to talk, I'm here. Evelyn would have wanted me to say that." We spoke for a few more minutes, exchanging pleasantries that felt like placeholders for a larger conversation neither of us was ready to have. When I hung up, I realized my hand was trembling. I set the phone down on the side table, and as I did, something slipped from between the pages of the photo album in my lap. An envelope, yellowed with age, landed face up on the floor. The handwriting on the front was Evelyn's, each letter precise and familiar as a heartbeat. The words read, "Open only when you need the truth." I held the envelope in my hands for a long time before opening it. Evelyn's handwriting seemed to pulse with life, each curve of each letter carrying her presence back into the room. The rain had stopped outside, leaving behind a silence so complete I could hear my own heartbeat. Open only when you need the truth. After everything that had happened in the past 2 days, I could not imagine needing it more than I did at this moment. The envelope contained a single sheet of paper folded twice in Evelyn's careful way. Her words were written in the blue ink she always preferred, the penmanship steady despite what must have been her illness when she wrote it. "My dearest Adrian," it began. "If you are reading this, then something has happened that I prayed would never come to pass. I knew there were storms gathering around our family, threats I could see even when you could not. I tried to protect you from the knowledge as long as possible, but I also prepared for the worst. Go to the metal safe box in the basement behind the old filing cabinet. The combination is our wedding anniversary. Inside you will find what you need to understand and to fight. Trust no one until you have spoken with Samuel Drake. He has been my confidant in this matter, and he will be yours. I love you, Adrian. I always have. Whatever you discover, remember that our life together was real. Our son is real. Do not let anyone convince you otherwise." The basement stairs creaked beneath my feet as I descended into the cool darkness below. The filing cabinet she mentioned stood against the far wall, a relic from my engineering days, filled with blueprints and permits from projects long completed. I had not moved it in years, had forgotten it was even there. But when I pulled it aside, I found what Evelyn had hidden, a small metal safe box, gray and unassuming, bolted to the wall behind the cabinet. The combination lock yielded to our anniversary date, and the door swung open with a soft click. Inside, stacked with Evelyn's characteristic precision, lay a collection of documents that took my breath away. Property deeds for our house, our vacation cabin, the small rental property we had purchased as an investment 20 years ago. Ownership certificates for vehicles, insurance policies, bank account statements. And beneath it all, a legal document I had never seen before, a will prepared and notarized, dated just 3 months before Evelyn's death. But there was more. Tucked into the corner of the safe, almost hidden beneath the stack of papers, I found 2 additional items. The first was a small USB drive, black and unlabeled, its purpose a mystery. The second was a sealed envelope, different from the one that had led me here. This one bore a name on the front in Evelyn's handwriting, Samuel Drake, attorney at law. I pulled everything from the safe and carried it upstairs to the kitchen table, spreading the documents across the surface like pieces of a puzzle. The will was extensive, far more detailed than the simple version I remembered us drafting together years ago. This one contained clauses and provisions I did not fully understand, references to trusts and contingencies, and conditions that seemed designed for scenarios I'd never imagined. And attached to the will was another note from Evelyn, this one brief. "There is more in this box than what you see, my love. When you are ready, Samuel will explain everything. Trust him as I did. Samuel Drake." The name was familiar. He had handled our estate planning years ago, a quiet man with careful eyes who listened more than he spoke. Evelyn had always liked him, had insisted on using his services even when I suggested cheaper alternatives. Now I understood why. She had been building something with him, preparing defenses I never knew existed. I found his number in Evelyn's old address book and dialed before I could talk myself out of it. The phone rang 3 times before a measured voice answered. Samuel Drake speaking. Samuel, this is Adrian Mercer, Evelyn's husband. There was a pause, weighted with recognition. Adrian, I've been wondering when you might call. I told him everything. The birthday dinner, the DNA test, Lydia's questions about nursing homes, the phone call I had overheard in the garden. I told him about Mrs. Patterson's warnings and Clara's strangely timed call. And I told him about the safe, the documents, the USB drive, and the envelope with his name on it. Through it all, Samuel listened without interruption, his silence on the other end of the line more eloquent than any response. When I finished, he spoke quietly, his voice carrying a gravity that made my chest tighten. Your wife knew this day might come, Adrian. She prepared more than you can imagine. The documents you found are only the beginning. We need to meet in person. Tomorrow, if possible. There are things I need to show you, things that will change how you see everything that's happened. What things? I demanded. What did Evelyn know that I didn't? Samuel hesitated, and in that hesitation I heard the weight of secrets kept too long. There's something Evelyn couldn't put in writing, he said finally. And there's someone else who knows, someone she trusted to watch over you. Samuel Drake's office occupied the second floor of a converted Victorian house on the older side of town, the kind of building that had witnessed generations of secrets and legal battles within its walls. I arrived the next morning with the documents from Evelyn's safe tucked under my arm, the USB drive heavy in my pocket, and a sleepless night carving shadows beneath my eyes. The receptionist led me to a corner office where Samuel waited behind a desk covered in neat stacks of files, his silver hair catching the light from a tall window that overlooked the street below. He rose to greet me, his handshake firm, but his eyes soft with something that looked like sympathy. Adrian, thank you for coming. Please sit down. I settled into the leather chair across from him and placed the documents on his desk. I brought everything from the safe, the will, the property papers, the USB drive. I needn't understand what Evelyn was preparing for. Samuel nodded slowly, pulling the stack toward him and beginning to sort through the papers with practiced efficiency. Your wife was a remarkable woman, Adrian. Most people go through life hoping trouble won't find them. Evelyn saw trouble coming from a long way off and built fortifications. He held up the will, its pages crisp and formal. This document is the cornerstone of everything. Let me explain what it means. For the next 30 minutes, Samuel walked me through the legal architecture Evelyn had constructed. Every piece of property we owned, the house, the cabin, the rental unit, remained solely in my name. There were no joint ownership provisions, no automatic transfers upon death or incapacity. Everything required my explicit notarized consent to change hands. But the most significant provision was something Samuel called an in terrorem clause. In Latin it means in fear, or as a warning, Samuel explained. Essentially, this clause states that if any beneficiary, specifically Julian, attempts to coerce, pressure, or unduly influence you regarding your assets or mental competency, he automatically forfeits all inheritance rights. Everything would then pass to charitable organizations Evelyn designated. I stared at him, the implications slowly crystallizing. Evelyn expected Julian to turn against me. She expected someone to try, Samuel said carefully. Whether Julian himself or someone controlling him, she wanted to ensure you had legal protection. This clause is your shield. If they push too hard, they lose everything. The weight of Evelyn's foresight pressed against my chest. She had seen this coming. While I was blind to the threats gathering around our family, she had been quietly preparing defenses, building walls I never knew existed. I thought of all the afternoons she had spent at this very office while I was at work. All the phone calls she took in the other room, all the small secrets I had dismissed as private matters. She had been fighting a war I did not know was being waged. Samuel opened a folder and slid a document across the desk toward me. There's something else you should see. Last month, approximately 3 weeks before your birthday dinner, a request came to my office for copies of your property documents. The request was made by Lydia Grant, claiming she needed them for family planning purposes. I picked up the document, scanning its contents. Lydia's signature sat at the bottom, her handwriting neat and confident. She tried to get my records. She did. The request was denied, of course. Without your authorization or a court order, those documents are protected. But the intent was clear. She was gathering information, mapping your assets, looking for vulnerabilities. Samuel leaned back in his chair, his expression grave. This wasn't curiosity, Adrian. This was reconnaissance. The word landed like a punch. Reconnaissance, a military term, the kind used to describe enemy movements before an attack. That was how Lydia saw me, not as family, but as a target to be assessed and neutralized. There's something else, Samuel continued, his voice dropping slightly. Something about Julian that I think you need to know. Evelyn handled it quietly at the time, asked me to keep it confidential unless circumstances demanded otherwise. I believe those circumstances have arrived. My stomach tightened. What about Julian? Samuel hesitated, choosing his words with care. 5 years ago, your son found himself in serious trouble. The kind of trouble that required a significant amount of money to resolve. Evelyn came to me, asked for advice on how to handle it discreetly. She and you ultimately provided the funds to make the problem disappear. The $200,000. The desperate phone call in the middle of the night. What kind of trouble? I asked, though part of me already sensed the answer. I'll explain fully when the time is right, Samuel said. For now, understand that it created a vulnerability in Julian, a weakness that someone with the right knowledge could exploit. Evelyn knew this. She worried about it constantly in her final months. I sat in silence, processing this new layer of betrayal. My son had kept secrets from me, had taken my money under false pretenses, had carried hidden wounds that left him open to manipulation. And Evelyn had carried that burden alone to protect me from pain. Samuel folded his hands on the desk. There's one more thing. I've been making inquiries over the past several months following threads that Evelyn identified before she passed. Threads connected to Lydia's father, Richard Grant. Mrs. Patterson's warning echoed in my mind. Elderly people. People like us. I've located a witness. Samuel continued, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. Someone directly connected to Richard Grant's past activities. Someone who has waited a very long time for the opportunity to speak the truth about what that family did. Who? I demanded. Samuel's eyes met mine, and in them I saw the careful flame of long-delayed justice. This witness lost everything because of Lydia's father. Her savings, her home, her faith in humanity. She's waited 10 years to tell her story. When she appears, Lydia will have nowhere to hide. I drove home from Samuel's office with my mind churning through everything I had learned. The in terrorem clause. Lydia's attempt to access my records, the mysterious trouble Julian had faced 5 years ago, and now a witness who had waited a decade for justice. Each piece of information added weight to a picture that was becoming clearer and more disturbing with every passing hour. But there was still the envelope from the safe, the one Evelyn had addressed to Samuel, and the full letter she had left for me that I had only partially read in my urgency to reach the lawyer. Now, sitting at the kitchen table with afternoon light streaming through the windows, Evelyn had chosen 30 years ago. I spread the pages before me and began to read from the beginning. My dearest Adrian, the letter began in her familiar blue ink, the handwriting steady despite what must have been tremendous physical weakness in her final weeks. I'm writing this knowing that my time is short, and there are things I must tell you that I could never say aloud. You have always been the strong one in our family, the foundation upon which everything else was built. But even foundations need protection, and I have spent these last months trying to build walls around you that will stand when I no longer can. I paused, my throat tightening. Even facing death, Evelyn had been thinking of me, working to shield me from threats I could not see. The depth of her love and foresight humbled me in ways I could not articulate. The letter continued. Never doubt our blood, Adrian. Julian is your son in every way that matters, in every way that is true. There will be people who try to tear you apart, who will use lies and manipulation to convince you otherwise. Do not let them succeed. I have seen the bonds between father and son, watched them form over decades of shared life, and I know what is real. Whatever evidence they present, whatever scientific claims they make, remember that I knew the truth. Our family is real. The words struck me with the force of prophecy. Evelyn had anticipated the DNA test, had known that someone would try to weaponize it against our relationship. She had seen through Lydia's schemes before I even knew they existed. I turned the page and found a section that made my blood run cold. Before Julian's wedding, I conducted my own investigation into Lydia's family. What I discovered disturbed me deeply, though. I struggled to share my findings with you or Julian. I didn't want to be the bitter mother-in-law who poisoned her son's happiness, but I should have spoken. I should have warned you both. Here the writing became uneven words crossed out and rewritten sentences that trailed into nothing. Whatever Evelyn had discovered, it had been difficult enough to write that she could not bring herself to put it all down. The only clear instruction that remained was this: look deeper into where she comes from. Her father's business dealings, his associations, the people he surrounded himself with. The truth is there if you have the courage to find it. Mrs. Patterson's words echoed again. Elderly people. People like us. What had Richard Grant done that had so disturbed Evelyn? What crimes lay hidden in the Grant family's past that my wife had uncovered but could not fully articulate? The letter continued with another revelation. If I'm gone and things go wrong, there is an old friend you can trust completely. Clara Whitmore has been my confidant in these matters. I asked her to watch over you, to be ready if the day came when you needed allies. Find her, Adrian. She knows more than she will say at first, but she will tell you everything when the time is right. Trust her as I did. Clara. Her strangely timed phone call suddenly made sense. She had not been checking in randomly. She had been watching, waiting, fulfilling a promise made to a dying friend. Evelyn had built a network of protection around me, invisible threads connecting people who would catch me if I fell. Near the end of the letter, the tone shifted. There is something I want to tell you directly, Adrian. Not through words on paper which can be misread or misunderstood, but face to face, voice to voice. I have recorded a message for you, something that explains everything I could not write here. When you are ready, when you have gathered the strength to hear my voice again, you will find it. Watch it alone. Let me speak to you one more time. The USB drive. The small black device that had seemed so mysterious now held the weight of Evelyn's final words, her voice preserved beyond death, waiting for me to press play. I was not ready. Not yet. But knowing it existed, knowing that I could see her face and hear her speak again, brought both comfort and a fresh wave of grief. At the very bottom of the final page, almost as an afterthought, Evelyn had written an address. It was the name of a financial institution I had never heard of, located in a city 3 hours away. The words were partially crossed out, as if she had debated including them at all, but enough remained visible to read. No explanation accompanied the address, no context for why it mattered, just another thread in the tapestry of secrets my wife had woven. The letter ended with a single paragraph that blurred as tears filled my eyes. I know you are angry with Julian. I know he has hurt you in ways that feel unforgivable, but he is still our son, Adrian, still the boy who ran to you when he was scared, who looked at you like you held the answers to every question in the universe. If he ever comes back to you broken, give him another chance. That is what a father does, and you have always been the best father I know. I folded Evelyn's letter carefully and placed it back in the envelope, her final words still echoing through my mind. The best father I know. I had spent 40 years trying to live up to that description, and now I faced the possibility that it had all been built on lies. But Evelyn's voice, even through ink and paper, reminded me of who I was. I was not a man who crumbled under pressure. I was an engineer trained to solve problems, to find structural weaknesses and reinforce them. It was time to stop being a victim and start being a strategist. Clara Whitmore lived in a modest cottage on the outskirts of town, surrounded by gardens that she tended with the same dedication Evelyn had given to her roses. I arrived unannounced the next morning, needing both the comfort of an old friend and the clarity that only distance from my own home could provide. She answered the door in gardening gloves and a sun hat, her face lighting up with genuine warmth when she saw me standing on her porch. "Adrian," she said, pulling me into an embrace that smelled of lavender and fresh soil. "I've been hoping you would come." We sat in her kitchen drinking tea while I told her everything. The birthday dinner, the DNA test, Lydia's questions about nursing homes, Mrs. Patterson's warnings, the contents of Evelyn's safe. Clara listened with the patient attention of someone who had been waiting for this conversation, her eyes thoughtful and knowing. When I mentioned finding the letter Evelyn had written and the instructions it contained, Clara nodded slowly. "She told me about the letter," Clara said quietly, "and about Samuel Drake. She wanted to make sure you would have guidance when the time came." I set down my teacup, a chill running through me. "I never mentioned Samuel's name to you, Clara. Not on the phone, not just now. How do you know about him?" Clara's eyes flickered away from mine, fixing on a point somewhere beyond the window. For a moment, silence stretched between us, heavy with unspoken truths. Then she picked up her tea and took a careful sip. Evelyn and I talked about many things in her final months. She was very thorough in her preparations. The deflection was obvious, but I chose not to press. Evelyn's letter had told me to trust Clara, and whatever secrets she was keeping would reveal themselves when the time was right. For now, I needed allies more than I needed answers. What should I do? I asked. I feel like I'm fighting shadows. Every time I think I understand what's happening, another layer appears. Clara leaned forward, her expression hardening with determination. Stay here for a week. Let Lydia think she's winning. People like her always overreach when they feel safe. If you disappear from view for a few days, she'll become bolder, more careless. That's when she'll make mistakes we can use. It went against every instinct I had. My home was my fortress, the place Evelyn and I had built together over decades. Abandoning it felt like surrender, but Clara's logic was sound. I was too close to the situation, too visible, too easy to manipulate. Distance would give me perspective, and Lydia enough rope to hang herself. I agreed to stay, and Clara set me up in her guest room with fresh sheets that smelled of sunshine. For the next 7 days, I watched from afar as Lydia launched her campaign of destruction. The reports came through Mrs. Patterson, through Samuel, through fragments of gossip that filtered back to Clara's quiet cottage. Lydia was telling everyone who would listen that I was showing signs of dementia. She spoke to neighbors with concerned sighs and worried glances, painting a picture of a confused old man who wandered at night and forgot basic details. She contacted Julian's co-workers, expressing fear that her father-in-law might do something dangerous. She even approached the pastor at the church Evelyn and I had attended for 30 years, tearfully requesting prayers for my declining mental state. The whisper network spread faster than I could have imagined. Within days, people who had known me for decades were looking at me differently, their eyes clouded with doubt and pity. Lydia had poisoned the well of my reputation with surgical precision, preparing the ground for whatever came next. On the 5th day, Samuel called with urgency in his voice. Adrian, I've been monitoring the situation, and I don't like what I'm seeing. They're preparing something related to your mental competency. There have been inquiries, quiet ones, about the process for obtaining guardianship over an elderly relative. I've seen this pattern before with elder abuse cases. They're building a narrative, establishing a foundation of witnesses who will testify that you're unfit to manage your own affairs. My grip tightened on the phone. How do we stop them? We need to move faster than they expect, Samuel said. Document everything. Establish your competency with medical professionals before they can claim otherwise. And Adrian, be very careful who you trust. They're not just after your property. They're trying to erase your autonomy entirely. After we hung up, I sat in Clara's garden as the sun began to set, the weight of Samuel's warning pressing down on my shoulders. Lydia was not just greedy. She was methodical, patient, willing to destroy my reputation and freedom to get what she wanted. This was not a family dispute. This was warfare. My phone buzzed with an incoming text message. The number was blocked, the sender anonymous, but the words on the screen made my heart stop. Check the bank address in Evelyn's letter. She left something important for you, a friend. The anonymous text burned in my mind as I drove to the bank address the next morning. Clara had offered to come with me, but something told me this was a journey I needed to make alone. Evelyn had left this for me, hidden it away for reasons I was only beginning to understand, and discovering it felt like a conversation between husband and wife that no one else should witness. The financial institution was located 3 hours away in a small city I'd visited only once before, decades ago, for a conference I barely remembered. The building itself was unremarkable, a modest brick structure with brass lettering above the door that spoke of old money and older secrets. Inside, the air smelled of polished wood and leather, and the receptionist greeted me with the quiet efficiency of someone accustomed to handling delicate matters. I presented my identification and explained that I believed my late wife had established an account in my name. The receptionist made a phone call, spoke in hushed tones, and within minutes I was escorted to a private office where a silver-haired banker named Mr. Holloway waited with a folder already open on his desk. "Mr. Mercer," he said, rising to shake my hand, "we've been expecting you. Your wife left very specific instructions that you would come eventually, though she hoped it wouldn't be necessary." He slid the folder across the desk, and I opened it with hands that trembled despite my efforts to stay composed. The first document was a bank statement showing a balance that made my vision blur. The numbers were substantial, far more than I had imagined Evelyn could have saved without my knowledge. But it was the second set of documents that truly stole my breath. Stock certificates, shares in Mercer Engineering, my own company, the firm I had built from nothing over 40 years of grueling work. I stared at the papers, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The dates on the certificates went back 15 years to a period I remembered all too well. We had nearly lost everything then. A major project had collapsed. Clients had fled, and I had spent sleepless nights wondering if I would have to declare bankruptcy and watch my life's work disappear. But we had survived. Somehow, impossibly, the company had stabilized. New investors had appeared, anonymous backers who asked for nothing except patience. I had always assumed it was luck, the universe finally cutting me a break after years of struggle. Now I understood. It had not been luck, it had been Evelyn. She purchased these shares through intermediary accounts. Mr. Holloway explained, his voice gentle. Slowly, quietly, over several years, when your company was at its weakest, she became your silent partner. She saved your firm, Mr. Mercer, and she never told you because she knew your pride would have made it impossible to accept. Tears streamed down my face, and I didn't bother to wipe them away. All those years, all those nights I had lain awake worrying about the future, Evelyn had been working behind the scenes to ensure we would survive. She had carried that burden alone, protecting not just our finances, but my dignity. I called Samuel from the car, reading him the details of what I had discovered. His voice carried a mixture of satisfaction and sorrow. Evelyn built this safety net over many years, he said. She called it her last shield. The money and shares are solely in your name, structured with conditions that protect you from any family member attempting financial exploitation. If anyone tries to claim those assets through guardianship or undue influence, the entire structure transfers automatically to charitable trusts she designated. She thought of everything, I whispered. She loved you, Samuel replied simply. And she was smarter than all of us. When I returned to Clara's cottage that evening, she was waiting on the porch with 2 glasses of wine and an expression that told me the time for partial truths had ended. I sat beside her in the fading light, the weight of the day pressing down on my shoulders, and waited for her to speak. The anonymous text, she began, her voice barely above a whisper. It was from me. I turned to look at her, and she met my eyes with a steadiness that reminded me suddenly of Evelyn. Evelyn called me 1 week before she died, Clara continued. She was weak. Her voice barely audible, but her mind was sharp as ever. She told me everything. The threats she saw gathering around your family, the preparations she had made, the people she needed to trust. And she gave me a mission. What mission? Clara's hands tightened around her wine glass. She said, if they try to destroy Adrian, help him find his way to Samuel. Watch over him from a distance. Don't reveal yourself until the moment is right. I've been waiting, Adrian, watching. When I called you that night, it wasn't coincidence. I knew something was wrong. I've been tracking Lydia's movements, her phone calls, her public campaign against you. I've been your guardian angel, invisible, but always present. The revelation washed over me like a wave, reshaping everything I thought I knew about the past weeks. Clara's perfectly timed phone call, her willingness to take me in without question, the anonymous text that had led me to Evelyn's final gift. None of it had been chance. It had all been orchestrated by a dying woman who loved me enough to build a fortress of protection that would endure beyond her last breath. I was never as vulnerable as they thought, I said slowly. Clara shook her head. Never. Evelyn made sure of it. Financial shields, legal protections, allies watching from the shadows. She built an entire system to keep you safe. All you had to do was find your way to it. My phone rang, Samuel's name flashing on the screen. His voice was tight with anticipation when I answered. Adrian, it's time to end this. I'm scheduling an emergency family meeting at my office. Julian and Lydia will both be required to attend. And the witness you mentioned, I asked. She'll be there, Samuel said, along with a special guest who has waited a very long time to tell the truth about the Grant family. The morning of the meeting arrived under gray skies that seemed to mirror the gravity of what was about to unfold. I dressed carefully in the suit Evelyn had bought me for our 40th anniversary, the one she said made me look like the man she had fallen in love with all those years ago. It felt right to wear it now, to carry a piece of her into the battle she had spent her final months preparing me to fight. Clara drove me to Samuel's office, her hands steady on the wheel while mine rested calmly in my lap. I was not nervous. For the first time since that terrible birthday dinner, I felt something I had almost forgotten was possible certainty. Samuel's conference room had been arranged with deliberate precision. A long mahogany table dominated the space, surrounded by leather chairs that would soon hold the key players in this family drama. Legal documents were stacked neatly at Samuel's end folders, color-coded and labeled with the meticulous organization that had characterized his entire career. The room smelled of old books and polished wood, the scent of generations of secrets being revealed and resolved within these walls. Lydia arrived first, exactly on time, radiating the confidence of a woman who believed she had already won. She wore a cream-colored blazer over a silk blouse, her jewelry understated but expensive, her makeup flawless. Every detail of her appearance had been calculated to project competence and concern, the devoted daughter-in-law forced to make difficult decisions about an aging patriarch. Her smile was sharp as she entered the room, sweeping her gaze across the assembled documents with barely concealed anticipation. Julian followed behind her like a shadow of the man he used to be. His face was pale, his eyes hollow, his shoulders hunched in a posture of perpetual defeat. He did not look at me as he entered, fixing his gaze instead on the carpet beneath his feet. This was not the boy who had run to me with scraped knees and impossible dreams. This was a man who had forgotten how to stand on his own, who had surrendered his voice to someone else's script. My heart ached for him, even as my mind catalogued his weakness as evidence of Lydia's manipulation. "Adrian," Lydia said, her voice dripping with manufactured warmth, "I'm so glad you agreed to this meeting. We've all been so worried about you." I met her eyes and said nothing. The silence stretched between us, heavy with unspoken truths, and I watched as the first flicker of uncertainty crossed her perfectly composed face. She had expected confusion, perhaps even absence, the shuffling entrance of a man whose mind was supposedly failing. Instead, she found me sitting calmly at the table, my hands folded, my gaze steady. The disconnect between her expectations and reality created a crack in her armor that I intended to widen. Samuel entered from a side door, carrying additional files that he placed at the head of the table. "Thank you all for coming," he said, his voice professionally neutral. "We have several matters to discuss today regarding the Mercer estate and certain irregularities that have come to my attention." "Irregularities?" Lydia's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "I'm not sure what you mean. We're here because we're concerned about Adrian's well-being, not because of any irregularities." "We'll get to concerns about Mr. Mercer's well-being," Samuel replied evenly. "But first I'd like to review some financial records that have recently come to light." At the words, "financial records," Julian flinched as if he had been struck. His entire body tensed, his hands gripping the arms of his chair, his eyes darting anywhere but toward me or Samuel. The reaction was too visceral, too immediate to be about my finances. This was personal guilt, the reflexive terror of a man whose secrets were about to be exposed. I filed the observation away, another piece of the puzzle clicking into place. Lydia noticed Julian's reaction too, and for just a moment her mask slipped. She shot him a warning glance, sharp and cold, a silent command to compose himself. Julian swallowed hard and stared at the table, his jaw clenched so tight I could see the muscles jumping beneath his skin. "Before we proceed," Samuel continued, "there's someone else who will be joining us today. Someone with information directly relevant to the matters at hand." The conference room door opened and an elderly woman stepped inside. She appeared to be in her early 70s, with silver hair pulled back in a simple bun and a face that bore the deep lines of someone who had weathered tremendous hardship. Her clothes were modest, a navy blue dress and sensible shoes, but she carried herself with a dignity that needed no embellishment. In her weathered hands, she clutched a manila folder thick with documents, holding it against her chest like a shield. But it was her eyes that commanded attention. They burned with a fire that decades had not been able to extinguish, the fierce determination of someone who had waited years for a moment of reckoning. She scanned the room slowly, taking in each face, until her gaze landed on Lydia and stayed there. The transformation in Lydia was instantaneous and devastating. All color drained from her face, leaving her skin the shade of old parchment. Her confident smile collapsed into something closer to horror. Her hands, which had been resting casually on the table, began to tremble. "You," Lydia whispered, her voice strangled. "You're not supposed to be here." The elderly woman's expression did not change. She walked to the empty chair Samuel indicated and sat down with the careful movements of someone conserving strength for what lay ahead. "I've waited 10 years for this moment," she said quietly, "and I'm not going anywhere until the truth is told." The silence that followed Lydia's strangled words stretched across the conference room like a held breath. I watched my daughter-in-law's carefully constructed facade crumble in real time. Years of practiced composure dissolving in the presence of this weathered woman, whose eyes held the weight of a decade's worth of suppressed fury. Julian looked between his wife and the newcomer with growing confusion, clearly lost in a narrative he had never been told. "My name is Margaret Thornton," the elderly woman said, her voice steady despite the emotion burning behind her eyes. 20 years ago, I was a retired schoolteacher living in Phoenix. I had a small pension, Social Security, and a modest savings account that I had built over 40 years of careful budgeting. It wasn't much, but it was mine. It was supposed to be my security. She opened the manila folder in her hands and withdrew a photograph, sliding it across the table. The image showed a younger Margaret standing beside a smiling man in an expensive suit, both of them positioned in front of a building with gold lettering that read, "Grant Financial Consulting." "That man was Richard Grant," Margaret continued, "Lydia's father. He ran a financial consulting firm that specifically targeted elderly clients, people like me. People who had spent their lives working hard and saving carefully, who trusted a man in a nice suit who promised to help their money grow." I glanced at Lydia, whose face had gone completely white. Her hands gripped the edge of the table so hard her knuckles had turned the color of bone. Julian stared at the photograph with dawning horror, pieces of a puzzle he had never known existed beginning to fall into place. "Richard convinced me to invest my entire savings with his firm," Margaret said. "He had charts and projections and testimonials from satisfied clients. He made it sound so safe, so reasonable. I gave him everything, $147,000, my life's work." Samuel reached into one of his folders and withdrew a thick stack of documents, spreading them across the table. Bank statements, legal filings, newspaper clippings, interview transcripts. Evelyn Mercer discovered Richard Grant's history during a background investigation she conducted before Julian and Lydia's wedding, he explained. She tracked down victims, collected evidence, and prepared a complete dossier on the Grant family's financial crimes. I stared at the documents, my heart aching with fresh grief for the wife who had carried this burden alone. Evelyn had known. She had uncovered the truth about Lydia's family and chosen to keep it hidden, hoping perhaps that love would somehow redeem the sins of the father. But she had prepared for the worst, leaving this evidence like a weapon to be drawn when the time was right. Richard Grant systematically drained the accounts of dozens of elderly clients, Samuel continued. He used their money to fund an extravagant lifestyle while sending his victims falsified statements showing healthy returns. By the time anyone realized what was happening, the money was gone, hidden in offshore accounts spent on luxury cars and vacation homes. "He died before he could be prosecuted," Margaret said bitterly. "Heart attack 8 years ago. He never faced a single consequence for what he did. And when he died, the money disappeared with him. There was nothing left to recover, nothing to return to the people he had destroyed." I looked at Lydia, searching for any sign of remorse, any acknowledgement of the suffering her family had caused. Instead, I saw only fear. The fear of exposure, of losing the game she had been playing for years. Samuel pulled another document from his folder. What Evelyn also discovered was that Lydia has been drowning in debt since her father's death. The lifestyle she presents to the world is a facade maintained through credit cards and loans and increasingly desperate measures. She needed access to significant wealth, and she found it in Julian Mercer. "That's not true," Lydia whispered, but her voice carried no conviction. "You didn't marry my son for love," I said quietly, speaking directly to her for the first time. "You married him for access to our family's assets. You targeted him the same way your father targeted Margaret and all those other victims." Margaret rose from her chair, her frail body trembling with emotion as she faced Lydia across the table. "Your father stole everything I had," she said, her voice shaking. "I lost my home, I lost my dignity. There were months when I ate cat food because I couldn't afford real groceries. Do you understand that cat food? Because your father wanted another sports car, another vacation, another bottle of champagne. Tears streamed down Margaret's weathered cheeks, but she did not look away from Lydia's face. I've waited 10 years to say this to you. 10 years of wondering if anyone would ever know the truth. 10 years of watching your family live comfortably while people like me struggled to survive. Your father was a monster, and you learned everything you know from him. The room fell silent, except for Margaret's ragged breathing. Julian sat frozen in his chair, his face a mask of shock and dawning comprehension. Whatever illusions he had maintained about his wife were shattering in real time, each revelation another crack in the foundation of his marriage. Samuel waited for the moment to settle, then reached into his folder once more and withdrew a sealed envelope. He placed it on the table directly in front of Julian, who stared at it as if it might contain a venomous snake. "And now?" Samuel said, his voice cutting through the heavy silence. "Let's discuss what happened 5 years ago. The $200,000 your parents paid without asking questions. The debt that made you vulnerable. The secret that your wife has been holding over you ever since." Julian stared at the envelope as if it contained his own death warrant. His hands remained frozen at his sides, making no move to reach for it, while the rest of us watched in heavy silence. I remembered the night 5 years ago when he had called me in desperation, his voice cracking with fear, begging for money he could not explain. Evelyn and I had wired the funds without hesitation, trusting that our son would tell us the truth when he was ready. He never did, and now the truth was about to be laid bare, whether he wanted it or not. "Open it," Samuel said quietly. Julian's fingers trembled as he broke the seal and withdrew the documents inside. I watched his face as he read, watched the color drain from his cheeks and the last vestiges of denial crumble into ash. Casino markers from establishments across 3 states, threatening letters from loan sharks with names that sounded like characters from crime novels, bank statements showing a systematic hemorrhaging of funds, a complete documentation of an addiction spiral that had brought my son to the edge of destruction. "Gambling," I said softly, the word carrying no judgment, only sorrow. "That's what the money was for." Julian could not meet my eyes. "I was in too deep," he whispered. "I kept thinking I could win it back, fix everything before anyone found out. But it just got worse. The debts kept growing. There were men who came to my office who followed me home. They said they would hurt me if I didn't pay. Your mother and I paid $200,000 to make those debts disappear," I said. "We saved you. We never asked for an explanation because we trusted you." Samuel withdrew another document from the envelope and placed it on the table. What Julian may not have told anyone is that the bailout came with conditions. In exchange for clearing his debts, Julian signed a legal agreement forfeiting any claim to family assets until after Adrian's natural death. It was Evelyn's idea, a protection against the possibility that the addiction might resurface and threaten the family's financial security. I looked at my son, understanding dawning. "You signed away your inheritance." Julian nodded miserably. "I was desperate. I would have signed anything. And I was grateful, Dad. I really was. I thought I could beat it, get myself together, prove that I deserved another chance." His voice broke. "I never told Lydia about the agreement. I was too ashamed." Lydia's face had gone rigid, her eyes calculating even as the walls closed in around her. She had not known about this document, I realized. Her entire plan hinged on Julian inheriting the estate, but he had already signed that possibility away years before she entered his life. "There's one more thing," Samuel said, reaching for his laptop. "During our investigation, we obtained a recording that I believe everyone in this room needs to hear." He pressed a button, and Lydia's voice filled the conference room, clear and unmistakable. It was a voicemail, the casual tone of someone leaving a message for a trusted confidant, never imagining it would be heard by anyone else. "Robert, it's Lydia. I wanted to update you on the situation. Julian is exactly what I expected, weak, in debt, too ashamed to tell his father anything. Men like that are the easiest to control. He's so desperate for approval that he'll do whatever I say without questioning it. The old man is the only obstacle now. Once we get him declared incompetent, everything transfers to Julian, and Julian does whatever I tell him. This is going to work. I can feel it." The recording ended, leaving a silence so profound I could hear my own heartbeat. Julian sat motionless, his face a mask of devastation as the full weight of his wife's betrayal crashed over him. This was not a woman who had fallen in love with him despite his flaws. This was a predator who had identified his weaknesses and exploited them systematically. "You knew," Julian whispered, turning to face Lydia. "You knew about the gambling before we even met." Lydia's composure finally shattered. "Julian, listen to me. That recording is taken out of context. I was just venting to my attorney. It doesn't mean anything." "You called me weak." Julian continued, his voice growing stronger with each word. "You said I was easy to control. You married me because you thought you could use me to steal from my father." "That's not true. I love you. Everything I've done has been for us, for our future together." "Our future?" Julian laughed bitterly, a sound I had never heard from him before. "What future you were planning to have my father committed to a nursing home so you could take his money? You used a fake DNA test to try to destroy his relationship with me. You've been lying since the day we met." I watched my son with a mixture of pride and heartbreak. The man sitting across from me was finally waking up, finally seeing the truth that had been hidden behind years of manipulation and shame. It was agonizing to witness, but it was also necessary. Julian could not begin to heal until he understood the full extent of what had been done to him. "Julian, please," Lydia said, her voice taking on a desperate edge. "We can still fix this. We can work together. Your father doesn't understand what we're trying to accomplish." "What you're trying to accomplish," Julian corrected her. "I'm done. I'm done being your puppet." Something snapped behind Lydia's eyes. The desperation transformed into fury, the mask falling away completely to reveal the calculating predator beneath. "Shut up!" she screamed, her voice cutting through the room like broken glass. "Don't say another word. You're ruining everything." Before anyone could react, she pulled out her phone and dialed 3 numbers with shaking fingers. 911, I need help. I'm being held against my will at a lawyer's office. There's an elderly man here who's become violent and dangerous. Please send someone immediately." Lydia's voice transformed the moment the emergency operator answered. The fury that had contorted her features vanished, replaced by trembling fear that would have convinced anyone who had not witnessed the past hour of revelations. She pressed the phone against her ear and spoke in a quavering tone, the performance of a victim so polished it made my stomach turn. "Please, you have to help me," she gasped. "I'm at a lawyer's office on Maple Street. There's an elderly man here who's become violent and unstable. He's holding us against our will. I'm afraid he's going to hurt someone. His name is Adrian Mercer. He has a history of mental problems. Please send someone quickly." She rattled off the address between manufactured sobs, her eyes darting around the room as if searching for escape routes from a threat that existed only in her imagination. Julian watched her with the hollow expression of a man seeing his wife clearly for the first time. Each lie, another nail in the coffin of their marriage. Margaret Thornton sat rigid in her chair, her weathered hands gripping the armrests as decades of suppressed anger found a new target. Samuel Drake, however, remained perfectly calm. He leaned back in his chair and folded his hands, observing Lydia's performance with the detached interest of a scientist watching a predictable experiment unfold. When she finally ended the call and looked up with triumph flickering behind her tears, Samuel simply nodded. "You just called the police," he said evenly. "Good, because I have something I'd like them to hear as well." The triumph in Lydia's eyes flickered into uncertainty. She had expected panic, had anticipated that the threat of law enforcement would scatter her enemies and buy her time to regroup. Instead, Samuel opened his laptop with deliberate patience, his fingers moving across the keyboard with the calm precision of a man who had been waiting for exactly this moment. "What are you doing?" Lydia demanded, her voice losing some of its manufactured fragility. "Playing another recording," Samuel replied. "One that I think puts your phone call in a rather different context." The laptop speakers crackled to life, and once again Lydia's voice filled the room. But this time the tone was completely different. Gone was the trembling victim. In her place was a businesswoman conducting a transaction that her words crisp and confident. "Dr. Harmon, thank you for taking my call. I understand your medical license situation has made things difficult for you financially. I have a proposition that could be mutually beneficial. I need a mental incompetency evaluation for my father-in-law. He's completely lucid. Should be clear about that up front. But I need documentation that says otherwise. A certificate stating he's unfit to manage his own affairs. Write whatever you need to write. I'll pay double your usual rate, cash untraceable. I need it within 2 weeks." The recording continued with Dr. Harmon's gravelly response negotiating terms, discussing the specific language that would be most effective for guardianship proceedings. It was a conspiracy laid bare, two voices calmly discussing how to strip an innocent man of his autonomy and dignity. That recording was obtained legally, Samuel said as the audio ended. Dr. Harmon's license was revoked 3 years ago for falsifying medical documents. When investigators approached him about other potential victims, he was quite cooperative. He provided this voicemail as part of a plea agreement. Lydia's face had gone the color of old chalk. That's not admissible. You can't use that against me. I'll sue you for invasion of privacy. Before Samuel could respond, the sound of sirens cut through the afternoon air. Within minutes, 2 police officers entered the conference room, their hands resting cautiously on their belts as they surveyed the scene. The older officer, a heavy-set man with gray temples, addressed the room with professional neutrality. We received a call about a disturbance, someone being held against their will. Lydia immediately resumed her performance, rising from her chair with tears streaming down her cheeks. Officers, thank God you're here. That man, she pointed at me, is mentally unstable. He's been threatening all of us. He needs to be taken somewhere safe before he hurts someone. The officer looked at me, then at the others in the room. Julian sat slumped in his chair, making no move to support his wife's claims. Margaret Thornton watched with grim satisfaction. Samuel stood calmly beside his laptop. Before you make any decisions, Samuel said, I'd like you to hear some evidence that's directly relevant to this situation. He played both recordings. The voicemail about controlling Julian and stealing from the elderly father-in-law. The conspiracy with the disgraced physician to fabricate mental incompetency documents. The officers listened in silence, their expressions hardening with each passing moment. There's more, Samuel continued, withdrawing a folder from his briefcase. These are admission documents for Sunset Grove Nursing Facility dated 2 weeks ago. They bear Adrian Mercer's signature authorizing his own commitment for long-term memory care. He spread the papers across the table. Mr. Mercer never signed these documents. The signature is a forgery. This woman was planning to have him involuntarily committed to a nursing home so she could gain control of his assets. The younger officer examined the documents, while his partner studied Lydia with new eyes. The transformation was immediate and devastating. The woman who had called them as a victim was now clearly the perpetrator. Ma'am, the older officer said slowly, filing a false police report is a serious offense. Combined with what we've just heard, I think you need to come with us to answer some questions. Lydia's manufactured tears dried instantly, replaced by the cornered fury of a predator whose trap had sprung shut around herself. This is a setup. They're all lying. I'm the victim here. But her protests fell on deaf ears. The evidence was overwhelming her own voice, condemning her more effectively than any witness could. As the officers moved toward Lydia, Samuel spoke again, his voice cutting through the chaos with quiet authority. There's one more thing, he said, about that DNA test. The room fell silent as Samuel's words hung in the air. The police officers paused, their attention shifting from Lydia to the lawyer, who clearly had more revelations to deliver. I felt my heart pounding against my ribs, sensing that we had arrived at the moment everything would change. Samuel withdrew a crisp document from his folder and held it up for everyone to see. The letterhead bore the name of a medical laboratory, the same laboratory printed at the top of the DNA test that had shattered my world on my birthday. I contacted this laboratory directly, Samuel said, his voice carrying the weight of undeniable truth. I asked them to verify their records regarding any DNA analysis performed for Julian Mercer. He placed the letter on the table and read aloud. We have conducted a thorough search of our database and archived records. We have no record of any test for Julian Mercer. No sample was ever submitted under that name. No analysis was ever performed. The document you have provided does not correspond to any testing conducted by our facility. We can only conclude that this document is a complete fabrication. The words detonated in the silence like a bomb. I stared at the letter, then at the DNA test that had torn my family apart. Understanding finally washing over me in a cold wave. It was fake. The entire foundation of Lydia's scheme, the weapon she had used to sever the bond between father and son, had been manufactured from nothing. Julian was my son. He had always been my son. Science had never said otherwise because science had never been consulted. Julian collapsed back into his chair as if his strings had been cut. His face crumpled, years of manipulation and lies catching up with him in a single devastating moment. "She told me it was real," he whispered, his voice breaking. "She said she'd found proof that you weren't my father. She said she'd had it verified by experts. I believed her. I believed her over everything I knew about our family, everything I remembered about growing up with you." I watched my son struggle to comprehend the depth of the betrayal. Lydia had not merely lied to him. She had constructed an elaborate fiction designed to poison the most fundamental relationship in his life. She had made him doubt his own identity, his own history, the very blood running through his veins. "There's more." Samuel continued spreading additional documents across the table. "These are the nursing home admission papers I mentioned earlier, along with power of attorney forms and medical consent waivers, all bearing Adrian's signature." He paused, letting the officers examine the papers. "All completely forged. Handwriting analysis confirms that none of these signatures were made by Adrian Mercer." Lydia Grant was days away from having her father-in-law legally committed to a memory care facility against his will, using fabricated documentation to seize control of his entire estate. The older police officer studied the forgeries with a grim expression. "Ma'am, you're looking at multiple felony charges: elder abuse, fraud, forgery, false imprisonment, conspiracy, filing a false police report. You have the right to remain silent." Lydia's composure shattered completely. "This is insane. They're framing me. Everything they're showing you is fabricated. I'm the victim here. My father-in-law has been manipulating everyone for months. He's the one who should be arrested." But her protests carried no weight. The evidence was overwhelming, documented and verified, her own voice on recordings that could not be disputed. The younger officer approached her with handcuffs, and she backed away until she hit the wall. "There's one final thing," Samuel said quietly. He reached into his briefcase and withdrew the small black USB drive that had waited in Evelyn's safe for this exact moment. Something that Adrian's wife left for him before she died. He inserted the drive into his laptop and turned the screen so everyone could see. The image that appeared stole my breath and brought tears flooding to my eyes. Evelyn's face filled the frame, thinner than I remembered, weakened by the illness that would soon claim her, but her eyes still burning with the fierce love that had defined our 40 years together. "Adrian," she said, her voice frail but steady, "if you're watching this, it means what I feared has happened. The threats I saw gathering around our family have finally struck. I wish I could be there beside you, fighting this battle together the way we faced everything else in our lives." She paused, gathering strength, and I could see the effort it cost her to continue. "I know Julian is weak. I've always known. He inherited my gentle heart but not your steel spine, and I know the woman he married doesn't love him. She saw his vulnerability and exploited it, but I want you to remember something important." Evelyn leaned closer to the camera, her eyes seeming to look directly into mine across the impossible distance of death. "Don't hate Julian. Hate the weakness if you must. Hate the betrayal, but never give up on our son. He was lost before he understood what was happening, manipulated by someone who studied his flaws like a predator studies prey. If he comes back to you broken, and I believe he will give him the chance to rebuild, that's what fathers do. And you've always been the best father I've ever known." Her image flickered slightly, the recording aging, but her final words came through crystal clear. "Whatever happens, Adrian, choose yourself. You've spent your whole life taking care of others. Now it's your turn. You deserve to be happy. I love you. I always have. I always will. Always." The screen went dark, and I sat in silence as tears streamed down my face. Evelyn had known. She had prepared for everything, fought for me, even from beyond the grave, left me weapons and allies, and finally this. Her voice reaching across death to remind me of what mattered most. The police handcuffed Lydia as she screamed accusations at everyone in the room, her words becoming increasingly incoherent as the reality of her situation crashed down upon her. They led her toward the door, her designer clothes and perfect makeup now meaningless armor against the consequences of her crimes. Julian remained in his chair, his body shaking with silent sobs. When he finally looked up at me, his face was the face of the little boy who used to run to me when he was scared, who believed I could fix anything broken in his world. "Dad," he whispered, tears streaming down his cheeks. "I'm so sorry." One of the days that followed the confrontation in Samuel's office moved with the strange momentum of an avalanche. Once the first stone had shifted, everything else came tumbling down with unstoppable force. Lydia was formally processed at the county jail that same evening, her designer clothes exchanged for orange scrubs, her perfectly manicured hands pressed against an ink pad for fingerprinting. The charges read like a catalog of her sins: elder financial abuse, fraud, forgery, filing, false police reports, and conspiracy to commit unlawful imprisonment. Each charge carried serious penalties under federal elder protection laws, the kind of statutes designed specifically to shield vulnerable people from predators who wore family smiles. Samuel called me the next morning to explain what would happen next. Lydia's bail had been set at $200,000, a sum she could not possibly raise given her mountain of hidden debts. Her court-appointed attorney was already negotiating, but the evidence was overwhelming. Multiple recordings in her own voice, forged documents with her fingerprints, a trail of victims stretching back to her father's crimes. The prosecutor had called it one of the most clear-cut elder abuse cases she had ever seen. News spread through our community with the speed of wildfire. The same neighbors Lydia had cultivated as allies, the ones she had whispered to about my supposed dementia, now distanced themselves with the frantic energy of people fleeing a sinking ship. Mrs. Patterson told me that within 48 hours of Lydia's arrest, 3 different women had called her to share stories of manipulation they had witnessed over the years but chosen to overlook. A borrowed item never returned. A subtle lie exposed too late. The way Lydia always seemed to know exactly what to say to make herself the victim of every situation. Social media became a digital pillory. Someone had recorded the police leading Lydia out of Samuel's building in handcuffs, and the video circulated through local Facebook groups with gleeful commentary. Her carefully curated online presence, years of posts showcasing her perfect marriage and enviable lifestyle, now served as evidence of her deception. Former friends shared screenshots of private messages where Lydia had complained about her elderly father-in-law, mocked his old-fashioned ways, expressed frustration at having to wait for her inheritance. The mask she had worn for so long was being torn away piece by piece, exposing the predator beneath for everyone to see. The financial collapse came swiftly. Banks flagged her accounts for suspicious activity pending investigation, freezing access to funds she had accumulated through years of manipulation. Credit cards were canceled. The luxury car she drove was repossessed when payments stopped. The lifestyle built on borrowed status and stolen dreams crumbled within days, leaving nothing but debt and disgrace. Julian moved out of the house he had shared with Lydia 3 days after her arrest. I learned this not from him directly, but from Samuel, who had been monitoring the situation. My son packed a single suitcase containing clothes and a few personal items, left his keys on the kitchen counter, and walked away from everything he had built his adult life around. He had nowhere to go. No money of his own, since Lydia had controlled their finances completely. No friends who were truly his rather than extensions of her social network. Just the crushing realization that his marriage, his entire adult life, had been an elaborate con designed to exploit his family. I wanted to reach out to him. Every instinct I possessed as a father screamed at me to find him, to offer shelter and comfort, to begin the long process of healing. But Evelyn's wisdom held me back. Julian needed to find his own footing first. He needed to feel the full weight of his choices before he could begin to make better ones. Rescuing him too quickly would only rob him of the growth that comes from struggling through consequences. So I waited. I returned to my routines, tending to the house that Evelyn and I had built together, maintaining the garden she had loved, sitting in her chair in the evenings with a book open on my lap, though my eyes rarely focused on the words. Clara visited often, bringing casseroles and quiet companionship. Margaret Thornton called once to thank me for finally exposing the Grant family's crimes, her voice thick with the tears of someone who had waited a decade for validation. 3 weeks passed. The summer heat softened into the gentler warmth of early autumn, and Evelyn's flower garden burst into its final bloom of the season. I was on my knees in the soil that afternoon, pulling weeds from around the roses she had planted the year we moved in, when I heard footsteps on the gravel path behind me. I turned, expecting Clara, or perhaps Mrs. Patterson, with another batch of cookies. Instead, I found myself looking at a figure I barely recognized. Julian stood at the gate, thin in a way that spoke of missed meals, his eyes hollow with exhaustion and something deeper that might have been shame. His clothes hung loose on his frame, wrinkled and unwashed. He had not shaved in days, perhaps weeks, and his hair was longer than I had ever seen it. He looked like a man who had lost everything. Because he had. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the garden, and somewhere in the trees a bird sang its evening song. My son gripped the fence with white-knuckled hands, his mouth working silently as he searched for words that would not come. Finally, in a voice barely above a whisper, he spoke. "Dad, can we talk?" I rose slowly from the garden soil, brushing dirt from my knees, taking in the sight of the man who stood before me. This was not the Julian I had seen 3 weeks ago in Samuel's conference room, the pale and hollow-eyed husband watching his marriage disintegrate. This was something worse. The expensive clothes Lydia had always insisted he wear had been replaced by worn jeans and a faded shirt that hung from his diminished frame. His face carried the gray pallor of someone who had not slept properly in weeks, and his eyes held the haunted look of a man who had finally seen himself clearly and could not bear the reflection. "Yes," I said quietly. "We can talk." Julian did not ask to come inside. He did not move from his position at the gate as if he understood that he had not yet earned the right to cross that threshold. Instead, he gripped the wooden fence and began to speak, his words tumbling out in a rush of confession that had been building for years. "Lydia filed for divorce," he said. "She disappeared 2 weeks ago, cleaned out what little we had left and vanished. Her lawyer sent papers saying she wants nothing from me except a quick end to the marriage." A bitter laugh escaped his throat. "There's nothing to take anyway. We were living on credit, Dad. Mountains of debt I didn't even know about until the collectors started calling. She was spending money we didn't have to maintain an image that was never real." I listened in silence, letting him empty himself of the poison he had carried for so long. "The gambling," he continued, his voice cracking. "It started small, a poker night with friends that turned into something darker. I kept thinking I could win back what I lost, dig myself out of the hole before anyone noticed, but the hole kept getting deeper. By the time I called you that night 5 years ago, I was being threatened by people who don't make empty threats. I was terrified, and I was so ashamed that I couldn't tell you the truth." He paused, swallowing hard against the tears that threatened to overwhelm him. "That's when Lydia appeared. It was like she knew exactly when to find me. She was sympathetic, understanding everything I needed at my lowest moment. She said she would help me rebuild. She said she believed in me when I couldn't believe in myself. I thought she was saving me. I didn't understand that she was positioning herself." The afternoon shadows lengthened across the garden as Julian continued his confession. He told me how Lydia had slowly isolated him from his parents, planting seeds of doubt and resentment that grew into walls. She convinced him that I was controlling, that Evelyn was enabling, that their concern was actually manipulation disguised as love. Every conversation became evidence of parental interference. Every act of kindness was reframed as an attempt to maintain dominance. "She rewrote my childhood," Julian whispered. "She took every memory I had and twisted it until I couldn't recognize my own history. The father who taught me to throw a baseball became an overbearing perfectionist. The mother who stayed up all night when I was sick became a guilt-manipulating martyr. She made me see you both as enemies." His voice broke completely, and he wiped roughly at his eyes with the back of his hand. "But there are some things she couldn't erase completely. I keep remembering you teaching me to ride my bicycle. I was 6 years old, and you ran alongside me for what felt like hours, your hand on the back of the seat, refusing to let go until I was ready. And when I finally shouted, 'I can do it, Dad,' you let go and I pedaled down that sidewalk feeling like the bravest kid in the world." The memory struck me like a physical blow. I could still feel the summer heat of that afternoon, still see Julian's small face scrunched in concentration, still hear his triumphant cry when he realized he was riding on his own. "I remember fishing trips where we sat for hours without catching anything and called it the best day ever," Julian continued. "I remember late-night talks when I was struggling in college, how you never made me feel stupid for not understanding something immediately. I remember the look in your eyes at my graduation, how you didn't say much, but I could feel how proud you were." His voice dropped to a whisper. "I forgot all of it, Dad. She made me forget who you really were, who we were together." Evelyn's voice echoed in my mind, her final message playing on an endless loop. "If he comes back to you broken, give him the chance to rebuild. That's what fathers do. And you've always been the best father I've ever known." I stepped closer to the gate, close enough to see the tears tracking down my son's unshaven cheeks. Part of me wanted to pull him into an embrace, to tell him everything would be fine, to fix this the way I had fixed every skinned knee and broken toy of his childhood. But I understood now that some things cannot be fixed by a father's love alone. Some things must be earned through struggle. I love you, Julian, I said carefully. I never stopped loving you. Not when you handed me that fake DNA test, not when you stood silent while Lydia tried to destroy me. Not even when I thought I had lost you forever. He looked up at me, desperate hope flickering in his exhausted eyes. But I can't save you from this, I continued. You have to rebuild yourself, not because I'm punishing you, but because it's the only way you'll ever trust yourself again. The only gift I can give you now is the chance to become someone you respect, someone who earns his own way, someone who can look in the mirror without flinching. The words hung between us heavy with love and truth, and the painful wisdom that sometimes the kindest thing a father can do is step back. Julian absorbed them slowly, nodding as understanding dawned through his exhaustion. Then, in a voice barely audible above the evening birdsong, he asked the question that held his entire future. Dad, is there any way I can start over? Any way at all? I opened the gate and let my son walk through. Not into my arms, not yet, but into the garden where his mother's flowers still bloomed with the stubborn beauty she had cultivated for decades. We sat together on the old wooden bench beneath the oak tree, and I told him the truth. There would be no easy redemption, no shortcut back to the relationship we had lost. But there was a path forward if he was willing to walk it one difficult step at a time. That night, after Julian left to find a shelter that would take him in, I sat alone in the living room and inserted the USB drive into my laptop one final time. Evelyn's face appeared on the screen, and I let the video play from beginning to end without pausing, without looking away, absorbing every word she had left for me like water soaking into parched earth. When the recording reached its final moments, I leaned closer to the screen, drinking in the sight of her face, the sound of her voice, the fierce love that burned in her eyes even as her body failed her. Whatever happens, she said, choose yourself, Adrian. You've spent your whole life taking care of others, taking care of me when I was sick, taking care of Julian when he was lost, taking care of everyone except yourself. Now it's your turn. Be happy. That's all I ever wanted for you. That's all I'll ever want. The screen went dark, and I sat in the silence she left behind, feeling something shift inside my chest. Not grief, though that would always remain. Something lighter, permission perhaps. The blessing of the woman I had loved for 40 years, telling me it was finally time to live for myself. 6 months later, the Evelyn Mercer Foundation opened its doors in a modest office building downtown. The mission was simple: protecting elderly individuals from financial exploitation, providing legal resources and emotional support to victims of the kind of predatory schemes that had nearly destroyed our family. Clara had helped me establish the nonprofit structure, navigating the paperwork and regulations with the competence of someone who had clearly done this before. When I asked her how she knew so much about charitable organizations, she simply smiled and said Evelyn had taught her. Margaret Thornton served on the advisory board, her weathered face now carrying something closer to peace than the suppressed fury I had witnessed in Samuel's conference room. She had transformed her painful history into purposeful action, speaking at community centers and senior facilities about the warning signs of financial abuse, sharing her story so that others might be spared the suffering she had endured. The foundation gave her what decades of waiting had not: a way to fight back that created light instead of darkness. Julian worked at the foundation as a volunteer coordinator. It was unpaid work, humble work, answering phones and organizing files and doing whatever needed to be done without complaint or expectation of recognition. He attended addiction recovery meetings 3 times a week, sitting in church basements and community halls with other people fighting their own demons, learning the vocabulary of accountability and the grammar of genuine change. He had found a small apartment near downtown, sparsely furnished but clean paid for, with money he earned working part-time at a hardware store. Our relationship rebuilt itself, not through grand gestures or dramatic reconciliations, but through consistent small actions accumulated over months of patient effort. Julian came for dinner every Sunday evening, arriving precisely at 6 with a bottle of sparkling water and the quiet gratitude of someone who understood what second chances cost. He helped maintain Evelyn's garden, learning the names of flowers he had never noticed during his childhood, developing calluses on hands that had grown soft during years of comfortable neglect. We didn't speak much during these visits, but the silence between us grew increasingly comfortable, filled with the slow reconstruction of trust that cannot be rushed. On a warm evening in late spring, I stood in Evelyn's garden as the sun began its descent toward the horizon. The flowers she had loved were blooming in profusion, lilies reaching toward the fading light, roses heavy with fragrance, lavender swaying gently in the breeze. The colors seemed more vivid than I remembered, as if the garden itself had been waiting for this moment of peace to fully reveal its beauty. Clara appeared beside me carrying 2 cups of tea in the mismatched mugs that had somehow become our tradition. She handed me one without speaking, and we stood together watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and rose and deepening purple. We didn't need words. The silence between us was comfortable, filled with understanding rather than emptiness, the companionship of 2 people who had weathered storms together and emerged into calmer waters. I thought about the journey that had brought me to this moment, the birthday dinner that had shattered my world, the revelations that had followed each one more devastating than the last, the discovery of Evelyn's preparations, her love extending beyond death to shield me from harm, the confrontation that had exposed Lydia's schemes and freed Julian from her manipulation, the slow, painful rebuilding that had followed brick by brick, day by day. I thought about Evelyn's final words, her command to choose myself after a lifetime of choosing others. For 68 years, I had defined myself by my responsibilities: engineer, husband, father, provider. I had measured my worth by what I could give to the people who depended on me. But now, standing in the garden my wife had planted, surrounded by the legacy she had left behind, I understood what she had been trying to tell me. Happiness was not selfish. Peace was not abandonment. Choosing myself did not mean forgetting the people I loved. It meant honoring them by living fully, by embracing the years I had left with gratitude and purpose. I closed my eyes and felt the warm breeze on my face, carrying the scent of flowers and freshly turned earth, and something sweeter that might have been memory or might have been hope. For the first time in years, there was no anxiety tightening my chest. No manipulation poisoning my relationships, no performance required to maintain a facade of family harmony. Just peace, just freedom, just life continuing forward into whatever came next. And for the first time in years, Adrian Mercer felt truly free. Adrian's story reminds us that betrayal can come from the people closest to us, but so can redemption. Evelyn's love proved that protection can extend beyond death when we plan carefully and trust the right people. And Julian's journey shows us that no matter how far we fall, the path back to integrity begins with a single, honest step. If this story touched your heart, you are not alone. Thousands of elderly Americans face financial exploitation from family members every single year. Many suffer in silence, too ashamed or confused to seek help. But as Adrian discovered, there are people who care, resources available, and justice that can be found when we refuse to give up. Thank you for staying with us until the very end. Your time and attention mean everything to us. If this story moved you, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel so you never miss another powerful story of resilience and justice. Share this with someone who needs to hear it, perhaps a friend or family member who might be facing their own struggles with trust and betrayal. We would love to hear from you in the comments below. Have you ever experienced betrayal from someone you trusted completely? How did you find the strength to rebuild? What part of Adrian's journey resonated most deeply with you? Your stories and insights help build a community of support for everyone who watches. Thank you for being part of our family. Until next time, remember, you deserve to be happy, and it is never too late to choose yourself.